Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the thick, fragrant air of an Ottoman coffeehouse. You push open a creaking wooden door and a wave of roasted coffee, piped smoke, and warm chatter rolls over you. Lanterns sway lightly above your head, their golden glow pooling on worn rugs and low tables. Men in flowing robes lounge on cushions, sipping from tiny cups, their laughter punctuating the steady clack of backgammon pieces. No baristas shouting names, no whirring espresso machines, just the soft clink of porcelain and the murmur of debate. You blink, adjusting to the dimness, and realize something else. There's no rush. No waiters pestering you to order more, no irritated glances if you linger. In fact, the whole scene seems suspiciously relaxed. You probably won't survive the night if you expect a Wi-Fi password or a frappuccino, but what you will get is a front row seat to one of history's most unexpectedly chill coffee cultures. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, where are you tuning in from? Drop your city and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle further inside, careful not to trip over a lounging cat, a regular here, by the looks of it, and find a spot near a low table. No menus are handed out, no one rushes to take your order. Instead, an older man with a silver-streaked beard simply nods at you, already pouring thick, black coffee from a battered copper pot into a tiny cup. You're expected to know what you're here for, and if you don't, well, you'll figure it out soon enough. Historians still argue whether the first Ottoman coffeehouses were modeled after Syrian prototypes or if they evolved independently, but what's clear is that by the 16th century, Istanbul's streets were dotted with them. From grand avenues to narrow alleys, these spots were more than a caffeine pit stop, they were the heartbeats of neighborhoods. And they were open to everyone, sort of. Sure, not everyone, this wasn't exactly an egalitarian utopia. Women, for instance, had their own ways to access the coffee scene, more on that later. But for many Ottoman men, from scholars to artisans, coffeehouses were the great social equalizer. There were no membership cards, no dress codes, just an unspoken agreement to sip, chat, and, occasionally, plot. It's no surprise the ruling class kept a wary eye on these joints. The drink itself, coffee, was still suspiciously exotic. Brought from Ethiopia and Yemen, these bitter beans stirred both fascination and fear. Some religious leaders declared coffee intoxicating, lumping it in with wine and spirits. Others, however, argued it kept you sharp, ideal for late-night prayer sessions or, say, winning a vicious backgammon game. You glance around and notice that, despite the laid-back vibe, there's an undeniable sense of purpose here. Discussions range from politics to poetry, the smoke-thick air vibrating with ideas and laughter. Ottoman coffeehouses didn't just allow free speech, they practically ran on it. And the rules? Let's just say, if you're used to today's no loitering signs and 1-hour laptop limits, you're going to be pleasantly surprised or horrified. Nobody's timing your stay. No one's rushing you to finish. In fact, the longer you linger, the more respect you earn. A good coffeehouse wasn't about quick transactions. It was about cultivating a rich, slow-brewed life. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. Some Ottoman coffeehouses even kept birds, finches and nightingales, their songs mixing with the human chatter. You haven't truly relaxed until you've sipped bitter coffee to the tune of live bird symphonies. And as you lean back against the faded cushions, cradling your tiny, handleless cup, it strikes you. The Ottoman Empire may have been sprawling and often authoritarian, but its coffeehouses were a pocket of unexpected liberty, a world where the only rule was to respect the cup, the conversation, and the cat snoring by your feet. You cup your hands around the little vessel, feeling its warmth seep into your palms. The coffee is thick, almost syrupy, with a bitterness that bites and then softens into something almost chocolatey. No foam art here, no caramel drizzle, just pure, unadulterated brew, boiled meticulously over a small charcoal brazier behind the counter. You sip and wince a little. It's strong enough to wake a dead sultan. See, the Ottomans didn't just drink coffee, they respected it. Brewing was a ritual. They used a seive, that long-handled copper pot with a narrow neck, and added the finely ground beans to cold water, sometimes a dash of cardamom if you were feeling fancy. They brought it to a slow, deliberate froth, never a boil, mind you, then poured it into demitasse cups where the grounds were left to settle like tiny edible sediment. Historians still argue whether the Ottomans learned this precise brewing method from the Yemeni or if they perfected it on their own. Either way, what you're sipping is not just a drink, it's a statement. A protest against rush, against sloppiness, against all things hurried and half-hearted. And speaking of protest, Ottoman coffeehouses didn't just smell like roasted beans, they practically reeked of revolution. Here, over endless cups, people debated policy, poetry, and philosophy. Scribes, merchants, soldiers, even the occasional rogue cleric, all huddled over these miniature mugs, plotting the future one sip at a time. It wasn't unusual for political factions to stake claim to particular coffeehouses. A spot near the Grand Bazaar might attract merchants fretting over tax hikes. A cafe by the port could be thick with sailors arguing about war strategies they'd never be asked to implement. Sometimes, gossip and political rumors spread so fast from coffeehouse to coffeehouse that the imperial court felt like it was playing a losing game of telephone. And here's a fun, fringe tidbit: if you didn't like what was being said, or if you got tired of waiting for your turn to rant, you could simply get up and leave for another coffeehouse down the street, mid-conversation. No hard feelings. It was like an early, analog version of rage quitting a group chat. You tilt your cup, watching the thick residue settle into an abstract pattern on the bottom. Some said you could even divine the future from the leftover grounds. Coffee divination, or tasseography, became an Ottoman pastime, especially among women, who would meet privately to decode the shapes and symbols swirling at the bottom of their cups. That horse you see? Could mean good news. That snake? Probably not. But for now, here in the heart of the coffeehouse, you're surrounded by the hum of low, intense conversation, the occasional outburst of laughter, the scrape of chair legs against stone. And no one seems in a hurry. They brew coffee as they live, slow, deliberate, with a dash of rebellion. It's not just the drink that's revolutionary, it's the experience. No clocks. No timers. No anxious glances at watches or muttered excuses about meetings. Time seems to fold in on itself here, thick as the grounds settling at the bottom of your cup. You swirl the last mouthful and consider ordering another. No one will judge. In fact, lingering is practically a sport in the Ottoman coffeehouse. But before you do, you notice something else. No one here looks particularly stressed about what they're wearing. Fancy robes mingle with plain tunics, turbans with simple skullcaps. And somehow, it works. But that's a story for the next cup and the next section. You shift on your cushion, stretching your legs out under the low table. Nobody bats an eye, comfort here is king. As you sip, you start to notice something odd for the 16th century. Nobody seems to care about what you're wearing. The guy next to you wears a plain wool tunic, threadbare at the elbows. Across the room, someone else lounges in silks that shimmer like a beetle's wing under the lantern light. No judgment. No side-eye glances. Just coffee and conversation. In Ottoman coffeehouses, there was no dress code. Sure, you could show off if you wanted to, wear your best kaftan, polish your boots till they blinded, but it wouldn't buy you special treatment. Status melted away the second you stepped inside. It was one of the few public spaces where sultans and beggars might breathe the same smoky air, theoretically at least. Historians still argue whether this lack of social hierarchy was intentional or just a happy accident of the coffeehouse culture. What's certain is that no one was checking labels. If you could afford a cup of coffee, and you could linger over it all afternoon, you were welcome. There were, however, a few unwritten rules. Wearing something too flashy might get you labeled a show-off, and while you wouldn't be kicked out, you'd be silently filed under trying too hard. Conversely, looking too disheveled might earn a few raised eyebrows. Ottoman society, after all, still prized cleanliness and modesty. You wanted to hit that sweet spot, respectable, but not ostentatious. Here's a quirky little tidbit for you. In some neighborhoods, men deliberately wore simpler clothes to coffeehouses than they did to the mosque. Why? To blend in. You didn't want your luxurious brocade coat becoming the main topic of conversation instead of your brilliant argument about the latest tax reforms. You glance down at your own outfit and shrug. Plain trousers, a loose shirt. Perfectly acceptable. No one's going to stop mid-conversation to appraise your hemline. They're more interested in what you have to say, or whether you're any good at backgammon. The absence of a dress code didn't just make coffeehouses more welcoming, it made them fertile ground for ideas. Without the visual markers of wealth and power, people listened a little more closely. Discussions could get intense. Arguments, heated. But rarely did it dissolve into violence. There was an understanding. The coffeehouse was a sacred space for discourse, not duels. Of course, not everyone appreciated this egalitarian spirit. Some of the empire's more conservative scholars argued that the coffeehouse blurred the lines of social order too much. Imagine their horror, a respected imam losing a chess match to a grizzled old fisherman, or a minor bureaucrat getting bested in poetry recitation by a tailor. Scandalous. Still, despite the occasional pearl clutching, the relaxed attitude toward dress and status endured. It was part of what made Ottoman coffeehouses so revolutionary, and so dangerous. Here, stripped of your title, your wealth, and your silk-embroidered credibility, all you had was your wit and your words. And maybe your cup. Speaking of which, you noticed the man next to you reaching into a cloth bag and pulling out his own cup, worn, chipped, but clearly beloved. Turns out, if you wanted to, you could bring your own. But more on that once you've refilled your tiny porcelain vessel. You watch curiously as the man beside you pours coffee into his own cup, a battered thing that looks like it has more stories than stains. He cradles it in his hands like a precious relic. You glance at your standard-issue cafe cup and suddenly feel a bit underdressed, at least as far as drinkware is concerned. Yes, you're allowed to bring your own cup. In fact, in the Ottoman coffeehouses, it's practically encouraged. Bring your own mug, your own pipe, maybe even your own cushion if you're feeling territorial. No one minds. In fact, it's a bit of a flex, a way of quietly telling the room, I'm not just a visitor here. I belong. Historians still argue whether this BYO tradition started out of necessity. Some coffeehouses were so packed, or so stingy, that they didn't have enough cups for everyone, or if it was just a way to add a personal flair to your daily hangout. Either way, a regular was easy to spot, the ones who came armed with a battered cup, a well-worn chess set, or even a personalized nargileh pipe, the mouthpiece wrapped in colored silk so no one else would dare use it. And it didn't stop at cups. Some patrons brought their own snacks, small plates of nuts, dried fruit, or the occasional sticky locum if they were feeling generous. The coffeehouses usually didn't serve food, or if they did, it was limited and not exactly the point. The real menu was conversation, debate, companionship. Bring your appetite for words. A quirky little tidbit? Some of the fancier coffeehouses in Istanbul would actually provide locked cabinets for regulars to store their personal items. Think of it like an early version of a gym locker, but instead of sneakers and protein shakes, it was velvet tobacco pouches and carefully seasoned clay pipes. You glance around and notice a few patrons delicately unpacking their treasures, an ivory-handled pen for doodling poetry, a chessboard so worn the squares are barely visible, a book of Hafiz's verses cracked open to a favorite stanza. The coffeehouse isn't just a place to drink, it's a second home, a public living room where possessions accumulate like talismans. The man beside you catches your eye and, without a word, slides his cup closer to you. The cup is cracked, a tiny vein running down the side, but it's clean and smells faintly of cinnamon. You take a polite sip and realize his coffee is slightly different, maybe a special blend he mixed himself before arriving. It's a small reminder, individuality thrives here, but quietly, respectfully. Nobody's holding up their handmade cup and announcing its craftsmanship to the room. In Ottoman coffeehouses, you flexed with understatement. Flashy wasn't fashionable, familiarity was. And so you sit back, your borrowed cup warming your hands, and absorb the atmosphere. No background music, no blaring TVs, no clickety-click of laptops. Just the human orchestra, a low hum of voices, the occasional rattle of dice, the scratch of quills against parchment. You wonder, briefly, how long you could sit here without being asked to leave. One cup, one evening? Maybe a full day? Turns out, you wouldn't be pushing your luck. Ottoman coffeehouses didn't just tolerate lingering, they practically demanded it. Stay, talk, dream, argue. The seat is yours as long as you need it. But fair warning, once you get comfortable, leaving might be the hardest part. You shift again, sinking deeper into the cushions, the smell of cardamom and roasting beans wrapping around you like a heavy blanket. You glance around. No one is checking their watch. No one looks like they're rushing out the door to meet some imaginary deadline. Here, lingering isn't a social faux pas, it's practically a badge of honor. In Ottoman coffeehouses, the whole point was to stay. Hours could slip by unnoticed, stretched long and loose like molten sugar. You might come in for a morning cup and still be there when the call to prayer echoes off the minarets at sunset. No barista shooting you dirty looks. No signs warning about a 45-minute seating limit. You stayed until your cup, your mind, and your soul were full. Historians still argue whether these extended visits were a cultural holdover from older Middle Eastern tea traditions or a brand new Ottoman invention. Either way, it suited the empire perfectly. In a world where the streets thrummed with traders, artisans, and soldiers constantly on the move, coffeehouses became islands of stillness, places where you could trade stories instead of goods, ideas instead of gold. And it's not like there was pressure to keep ordering. You weren't expected to buy a second cup, or a third. Your single purchase entitled you to a full evening's worth of chatter, games, and people watching. It was an early version of the third place, not home, not work, but somewhere else entirely, somewhere you belonged just because you showed up. Want to bring a backgammon set and settle in for a 6-hour tournament? No problem. Want to sit quietly in the corner sketching the folds of someone's turban? Totally fine. Want to passionately debate the finer points of Persian poetry until you're hoarse and out of breath? Highly encouraged. A quirky tidbit for you, some regulars became so synonymous with their favorite coffeehouses that they had unofficial reserved spots. Same cushion, same low table, every day. Not because the owners set it aside, but because the social rhythm just fell into place. It was understood, that's Hassan's corner, best not sit there unless you want a long, awkward stare. You lean back, cup balanced on your knee, and watch as a group gathers near the center of the room. There's laughter, the scrape of wooden stools, the familiar rattle of dice. They're not hurrying either. Moves are made with a kind of deliberate laziness, as if winning were secondary to the slow savoring of the game itself. Even the serving boys, slim youths with copper trays balanced expertly on fingertips, seem in no rush. They drift from table to table like leaves on a lazy stream, refilling cups only when summoned by a subtle nod or a lifted eyebrow. It hits you, this is what coffee was made for. Not just for the caffeine kick, although, let's be honest, that doesn't hurt, but for the permission to pause. To let your mind wander. To let conversations sprawl into unexpected corners. Modern cafes might sell speed, grab and go, hustle and flow, but Ottoman coffeehouses sold something rarer, time. Time to talk, to think, to simply be. And just when you think you've seen it all, you overhear the table next to you heatedly debating something that would get most modern cafes nervously checking their security cameras. Politics. No croissants. No paninis. But plenty of hot takes on the latest palace intrigue. You tilt your head, pretending to study the tiny bubbles clinging to the side of your coffee, but really, you're eavesdropping. The conversation at the next table is lively, to say the least. They're deep into a spirited debate about the latest firman, the imperial decree, rumored to have shaken the local guilds. The words come fast, hot, and caffeinated. In the Ottoman coffeehouse, this wasn't unusual. In fact, it was expected. Politics wasn't whispered behind closed doors or saved for private dinners. It was shouted across chipped tables and thick clouds of smoke, where everybody could weigh in, and everybody did. Historians still argue whether these open debates were tolerated because of the empire's diversity of voices or in spite of it. Either way, the coffeehouse became a kind of unofficial parliament, a place where artisans, clerks, soldiers, and the occasional rogue poet could dissect the latest news and policies. No need for printed newspapers when you had the human bulletin board of a coffeehouse. And it wasn't just politics. Religion, philosophy, literature, all were fair game. No one was safe from critique, not even the Sultan himself, although, perhaps wisely, people kept their voices low when treading near the throne. It's a far cry from modern cafes, where maybe you overhear someone murmuring about real estate prices. Here, entire political movements percolated between cups. More than once, the authorities tried to shut down coffeehouses precisely because they were seen as breeding grounds for dissent. Some rulers outlawed coffee itself, hoping that without the drink, the chatter would cease. Spoiler, it didn't work. People just brewed it at home, and the conversation carried on in private salons. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. Some of the more popular coffeehouses even had resident debaters, men whose sole claim to fame was their sharp tongues and sharper wits. They weren't paid. They didn't serve the coffee. They just argued, dazzling the regulars with their verbal fireworks. Think of them as the Ottoman Empire's version of professional talk show hosts, minus the camera crew. You sip again and glance around. No one's checking their phone. No one's scrolling through an endless feed. They're fully present, locked. Into the moment, into the heat of the debate. Hands gesture wildly. Heads nod in vigorous agreement or shake in dramatic dissent. Someone slams a palm against the table to emphasize a point, causing a chess piece to wobble and fall. There's a pause, a round of laughter, and then the argument resumes with even more gusto. You can't help but grin. It's impossible to imagine this level of passionate conversation happening in a modern coffee chain without someone calling security. Here, it's just Tuesday. And while there are no pastries on offer, no flaky croissants, no syrupy muffins, the real indulgence is in the discussion. Intellectual calories, if you will. In fact, the absence of food might be part of the magic. Without plates and platters cluttering the table, there's nothing to distract from the real feast, a battle of ideas, washed down with endless tiny cups of bitter, bracing coffee. You finish your cup and set it down carefully. Around you, the debate rages on, but it's not hostile. It's lively, earnest, even joyous. It reminds you that disagreement doesn't have to be a war. It can be an art form, sharpened with humor and softened with respect. And if you happen to need another round to keep up, well, Ottoman coffeehouses open long before dawn and stayed open long after midnight. You yawn and stretch, blinking up at the low-hanging lanterns. The night outside is thick and dark, but in here, it's a steady glow of golden comfort. You glance at the doorway, half expecting to see a closing sign or a weary owner herding customers out with tired shrugs. Instead, a new group wanders in, one man, half asleep, still tying his sash, and another bright-eyed, ready for conversation. No one blinks. It's well past what modern folks might call closing time, but in the Ottoman coffeehouse, the idea of closing doesn't really exist. Ottoman coffeehouses were notorious for their hours. Open before the first rooster crowed and still welcoming stragglers after the stars blinked awake. Morning, noon, midnight, didn't matter. If you wanted coffee at 4 a.m., you got coffee at 4 a.m. Historians still argue whether these 24-hour practices were widespread or just a feature of big city coffeehouses like those in Istanbul, Damascus, or Cairo. Either way, it's clear that the coffeehouse wasn't designed for people with rigid schedules. It was a space molded by its patrons, early risers, night owls, insomniacs, dreamers, all flowing through at their own pace. And you wouldn't be judged for it. Stumbling before dawn, bleary-eyed and barely dressed? Welcome. Swing by after an evening of storytelling and music? Grab a cushion. The whole point was to be available when you needed it, not when the shopkeeper thought it was convenient. A quirky tidbit for your sleepy brain, some coffeehouses even adjusted their ambience based on the time of day. Mornings were quieter, perfect for scholars scratching ink onto parchment. Afternoons buzzed with tradesmen and merchants. Evenings, though, were prime time for music, poetry, and wild debates. The later it got, the more relaxed the rules became, until formality dissolved completely into laughter, song, and the steady murmur of voices too full of caffeine to sleep. You glance around and notice the crowd shifting, the serious debates winding down, replaced by the easy murmur of friends swapping stories. A man in the corner softly plucks a oud, its melancholy notes curling through the smoke. Someone else chuckles at a private joke, the sound low and familiar, like the purr of a well-fed cat. No one's checking the clock. There's no last call. If you're still talking, still sipping, still breathing, you're welcome to stay. The coffeehouse will outlast even the stubbornest chatterboxes, quietly enduring through the night like a patient host who never grows weary. And just when you think it can't get more welcoming, you notice another oddity. The young server who refilled your cup hours ago wanders by again. You nod your thanks, but he doesn't hover, doesn't tap his foot impatiently. No bill, no receipt, no are you done yet? Look. You'll settle up whenever you're ready, no rush, no pressure. Maybe it's the lingering taste of cardamom on your tongue or the drowsy pull of late-night conversation, but you start to wonder, what would it be like if all cafes worked this way? No glancing at your phone to justify staying. No side glances from baristas waiting to clean your table. Just you, your thoughts, your friends, and a never-ending stream of coffee. And if you happen to run out of coins or forget to tip, well, in the Ottoman coffeehouse, that wasn't the end of the world either. You dig into your sash, fishing for a few coins, but the truth is, you could probably get away without paying right now. Ottoman coffeehouses were famously forgiving about small debts and forgotten tips. In fact, it was part of the culture. Generosity flowed as freely as the coffee itself. Tipping? Optional. Some patrons did it as a polite nod, slipping a coin onto the tray or tucking one into the server's hand with a smile. Others simply offered a word of thanks or a slight bow of the head. No one was standing around, awkwardly waiting for a gratuity. No suggested tip percentages blinking on a little handheld screen. Here, the currency was conversation, loyalty, and presence. Historians still argue whether this relaxed approach came from the Islamic principle of hospitality or just a long-standing tradition of valuing community over cash. What's clear is that Ottoman coffeehouses weren't just profit-driven businesses, they were social ecosystems. Your presence, your regular visits, your willingness to engage, that was worth far more than a few silver axes. A quirky little tidbit for you, some coffeehouses even had a suspended coffee system centuries before modern cafes tried to make it trendy. Wealthier patrons would quietly pay for an extra cup or two, to be claimed later by someone who couldn't afford their own. It was a simple, dignified system of silent charity. No bragging, no announcements, no humiliating vouchers, just a warm drink, waiting patiently for whoever needed it. You glance around and notice the easy, fluid movements of the servers. They aren't aggressively upselling, not waving menus under noses or clearing half-empty cups to flip tables faster. They know the names of their regulars, their preferred brews, even their favorite cushions. You suspect that half the time, the coins are a pleasant bonus, not the point. And if you were a regular, someone who showed up every day, brought their own cup, joined in the conversations, and treated the space with respect, you might occasionally find a cup waiting for you, no charge. A subtle reward for loyalty, woven into the fabric of the coffeehouse, no fuss required. There's something deeply human about it. You're valued not for the thickness of your wallet but for the weight of your words, the kindness of your gestures, the constancy of your presence. It makes you wonder if they had fewer customer complaints back then, when the transaction was less about money and more about community. You sip again, the dregs thick and grainy at the bottom of the cup, and lean back to watch the slow dance of life around you. A merchant recounts his day's sales, laughing over missed opportunities. A student pores over a battered manuscript, occasionally sipping absent-mindedly. Two old men argue good-naturedly about who is a better poet, Rumi or Hafiz. No one rushes. No one hovers. You realize that, here, tipping isn't a reward for fast service. It's a small, optional thank you for being given a place in this timeless little world. And you, by merely being here, have become part of the furniture, another thread in the coffeehouse's tapestry. You grin into your cup and think, maybe the best part isn't how long you can stay, but how welcome you feel while doing it. And if you happen to come alone? Don't worry. In an Ottoman coffeehouse, loneliness doesn't stand a chance. You shift in your seat and glance around. It's your first time here, but it doesn't feel that way. Smiles flicker your way, and a man with a graying beard raises his cup in a casual salute. You haven't even spoken to him yet. In an Ottoman coffeehouse, it seems you're already halfway to friendship just by walking in. Coming solo? That's not a problem. In fact, it's almost expected. Coffeehouses weren't just places to meet old friends, they were where you made new ones. Strangers chatted easily, and before you knew it, you'd be pulled into a game of chess or a heated debate about the best verses of Sa'di. Historians still argue whether the coffeehouse was the Ottoman Empire's great social equalizer or if it just created a different kind of social hierarchy, one based on wit, charm, and conversational prowess rather than bloodlines or bank accounts. But one thing is certain, you didn't stay a stranger for long. There was a kind of ritual to it. You'd walk in, order your coffee, and quietly take a seat. Before the cup cooled, someone would nod your way or motion you over to join a game, a discussion, or a listening circle. It was understood that if you were here, you wanted to be part of something. Here's a quirky little tidbit, some Ottoman coffeehouses even employed unofficial greeters, regulars who took it upon themselves to welcome newcomers, introduce them around, and make sure no one sat alone too long. Think of them as volunteer social coordinators, working not for tips but for the pure joy of building a buzzing, vibrant community. You catch a snatch of conversation, something about a new poem circulating in the market stalls, and without thinking, you lean closer. The bearded man notices, smiles, and gestures for you to join. No questions asked. No formal introductions. You simply slide your cup over, settle onto a cushion, and become part of the flow. Conversation here isn't guarded or stiff. It's lively, generous, with just the right amount of sarcasm and good-natured teasing. One man jokingly accuses another of reciting Hafiz like a lovesick camel. The table bursts into laughter, including the target of the jab, who throws back a playful insult of his own. And the best part? No awkward small talk. No so, what do you do? Interrogation. Topics leap straight to the good stuff. Philosophy, politics, poetry, local gossip, the quality of last week's market figs. You're expected to have an opinion, even if it's a ridiculous one, and to defend it with flair. You might think all this mingling could get overwhelming, but the Ottoman coffee house had a rhythm. Conversations ebbed and flowed. People drifted from table to table like friendly nomads, always moving but never rushing. You could linger at one table all night or float from group to group, gathering snippets of debate and laughter like seashells. And the friendships? They didn't end when you drained your cup. Regulars became fixtures in each other's lives. Their bonds brewed slowly over countless shared evenings. Business partnerships formed. Marriages were proposed. Revolutions were whispered into life, all between sips of dark, potent coffee. You glance around again and realize something remarkable. Nobody here is truly alone. Even the man sketching in the corner has someone occasionally glancing over, nodding approval at his rough lines and ink stains. The Ottoman coffee house didn't just serve coffee, it served connection. And for the price of a single small cup, you'd walk out with a full heart and a few new allies in your pocket. But just wait until someone cracks a joke. Because in here, bad puns aren't just tolerated, they're practically a house specialty. You're mid-sip when it happens. A man at the next table, a wiry fellow with an impressive mustache, leans forward and delivers a pun so outrageous that you nearly spit your coffee. The table bursts into laughter, sharp, genuine, belly deep. And just like that, you realize, in the Ottoman coffee house, bad jokes are the secret house blend. If you thought coffee houses were solemn halls of philosophical debate, think again. Sure, heavy topics floated through the air like pipe smoke, but so did wit. Jokes, puns, riddles, these were the true currency of conversation. And the worse they were, the better. Historians still argue whether this love of wordplay was rooted in Turkish folk traditions or if it was imported along with the coffee from Persia and Arabia. What's clear is that Ottoman coffeehouses prize quick wit and a sharp tongue. A well-placed joke could win you friends faster than any show of wealth or status. Quirky tidbit for you, impromptu pun competitions were a thing. Two men, or whole tables, would volley jokes back and forth like a verbal tennis match. The rules were simple: keep it flowing, keep it clever, and most importantly, keep it coming. When someone finally groaned or couldn't think of a retort, they had to buy the next round of coffee. The jokes weren't always original. Often they were old standards, polished and repolished through years of use, much like the battered chessboards and worn cushions. But delivery was everything. A clever twist, a theatrical pause, a raised eyebrow at just the right moment, that's what earned nods of approval and stifled chuckles. You get the feeling that if you dared to chime in with a pun of your own, you'd be welcomed instantly, no matter how terrible it was. In fact, the worse it was, the louder the laughter might be. And unlike today's rapid-fire memes and one-liner culture, here the jokes were savored. They weren't throwaway punchlines, they were verbal crafts, each one carefully brewed like the coffee itself, dark, rich, sometimes bitter, often hilarious. You glance at the mustachioed man, who's now miming a camel slipping on a banana peel to delighted hoots from his companions. Across the room, another table is engaged in a mock-serious debate over the best joke involving a merchant, a mule, and a bag of almonds. Even the servers get in on it. One youth balancing a tray full of cups lets loose a perfectly timed quip about how slow the chess players are. Even the coffee grounds have aged waiting for your next move. The room roars with laughter, and the players, grinning, tip him a few coins. The jokes knit the room together, a soft, constant thread of humor that made even strangers feel like part of a long-running inside joke. It was a release valve for the heavier conversations, a reminder that life, however complex and taxing, was meant to be enjoyed. You sip the last of your coffee and set the cup down gently. Around you, the laughter ebbs and flows like a familiar tide. You realize that in a world that often demanded seriousness and conformity, the Ottoman coffeehouse offered something radical, the chance to play. And as the laughter settles into a soft murmur, you hear something else, a few patrons clearing their throats, tuning their instruments, readying for another performance where, fortunately, musical talent is highly optional. You lean back on your cushion, cup empty but spirit full, as a man with a battered oud plucks a few tentative notes. Another regular taps a small drum, setting a beat so gentle it could rock a child to sleep. Slowly, like moths to a lantern, the coffeehouse shifts its focus. Talk softens, Laughter simmers down, and all eyes turn toward the impromptu band. In the Ottoman coffeehouse, music was as common as coffee grounds, especially the unpolished kind. Singing wasn't reserved for the talented. If you had a voice and a song in your heart, you had a stage. And that stage? A worn rug in the center of the room, lit by lanterns and heavy with the scent of tobacco and roasted beans. Historians still argue whether this musical tradition stemmed from the Sufi gatherings, where music was a form of devotion, or if it grew out of older folk practices. Either way, Ottoman coffeehouses blurred the lines between professional and amateur, artist and audience. If you could hum a tune, or even if you couldn't, you were welcome to try. A quirky tidbit for you, some coffeehouses kept spare instruments lying around, ready for anyone to pick up. A slightly warped tambourine, a flute missing a note or two, a lute with a cracked body but perfect strings. Music wasn't about perfection. It was about participation. You watch as the man with the oud launches into a psalm. His voice is rough, frayed at the edges, but full of heart. A few patrons join in, some clapping softly, others adding shaky harmonies. No one boos. No one critiques. There's a collective understanding that the goal isn't a flawless performance, it's connection. And it's not all solemn, haunting ballads either. Plenty of songs are ribald and funny, telling stories of lazy husbands, nosy neighbors, or hapless fishermen who somehow managed to lose their entire catch, and their boat. These musical tales unfold with wide grins and frequent chuckles, another layer of the coffeehouse's rich, communal fabric. The musicians aren't competing for tips. They aren't angling for fame. They're just sharing. In the Ottoman coffeehouse, the reward for a song was simple: a nod, a smile, a fresh cup of coffee brought to your table by an appreciative listener. You glance around and notice something even more charming: patrons who don't sing tap their cups in time, or sway slightly to the beat. Some close their eyes, letting the music weave around them like smoke. It's low-key, unpretentious, comforting. There's a kind of democracy to it. No one demands your credentials. No one asks if you've trained under a master musician or if you can hit the high notes. The only qualification is willingness. You consider joining in, maybe humming along or tapping the rhythm against your knee. No one would mind. In fact, they'd probably smile and scoot over to make room for you. Here, music is another way of saying, you belong. And as the last note drifts upward, swallowed by the wooden rafters, there's a brief, companionable silence. No wild applause, no standing ovations. Just a few clinks of coffee cups and a renewed buzz of conversation. You get the feeling that in Ottoman coffeehouses, the line between performer and audience is as thin as a wisp of smoke. Everyone's part of the show, whether they realize it or not. And if music wasn't your thing, well, there were always other ways to test your mettle, like the backgammon tables now being fiercely contested just across the room. You turn toward the rattle of dice on wood, the low murmur of strategic plotting, and catch sight of a backgammon board mid-battle. Two men sit cross-legged, their faces a study in serious concentration, their hands poised above the checkered surface like generals about to move troops. In the Ottoman coffeehouse, backgammon was king. Chess had its loyal devotees, serious, bookish types poring over every move, but backgammon was the people's game. Fast, noisy, unpredictable. Perfect for the lively, slightly chaotic atmosphere that rolled through these smoky halls. Historians still argue whether the game traveled with traders from Persia or was an independent Ottoman obsession, but either way, it became a coffeehouse fixture. Tables weren't complete without a worn, battered board, the points faded by years of triumphs and defeats, and a set of dice smoothed from endless tumbling. And don't be fooled, this wasn't polite, gentle competition. Ottoman backgammon was loud, boisterous, and deeply competitive. Dice were thrown with a satisfying clatter, pieces slammed down with triumphant grins. Players argued over moves, teased each other mercilessly, and celebrated victories with the kind of enthusiasm modern sports fans might reserve for a last-second goal. A quirky tidbit for you: in some coffeehouses, there were unwritten rules about how you rolled your dice. A lazy, half-hearted toss? Frowned upon. A strong, dramatic shake and release? Highly respected. Some even developed elaborate, almost theatrical rolling rituals, believing a good roll wasn't just chance, it was a performance. You watch as one player makes a risky move, sliding his pieces home with a cocky grin. His opponent groans dramatically, flopping back against his cushion, and the crowd around them chuckles. Someone claps mockingly. Another offers unsolicited advice, which is, of course, ignored. It's all part of the fun. Winning is sweet, but the real prize is the banter, the camaraderie, the shared acknowledgement that even in a sprawling empire, life could be distilled down to a handful of dice and a simple board. You notice that spectators are just as involved as the players, shouting encouragement, groaning at bad luck, suggesting daring strategies. It's communal theater, a lively break from politics and poetry, where fortunes shift on a single roll. No stakes are exchanged, no money, no coffee bets, no IOUs. Just pride, bragging rights, maybe the right to swagger a little on your way to the counter for another cup. And backgammon wasn't confined to the elite coffeehouses of Istanbul either. Wander into any dusty village cafe along the empire's sprawling reach, and you'd likely find the same scene: men hunched over worn boards, eyes glittering with competitive fire, laughter spilling into the evening air. You lean closer, watching the match unfold. One of the players spots you, flashes a grin, and gestures for you to join the next round. You nod, realizing that even if you lose spectacularly, and let's be honest, you probably will, you'll gain something better, another thread woven into the coffeehouse's vast, welcoming tapestry. And just when you think the night can't get any more charming, a side door creaks open and a few women, veiled but bright-eyed, slip quietly into a partitioned corner, coffee cups in hand. Turns out, the Ottoman coffeehouse wasn't entirely a boys' club after all. You glance toward the corner where the women settle, their movements smooth, practiced, as if this routine has unfolded countless times before. A low, discreet partition shields their gathering, nothing overt, just a subtle nod to custom. They lift their veils just enough to sip from delicate cups, their laughter a soft, chiming counterpoint to the deeper rumbles of the main room. In the popular imagination, Ottoman coffeehouses are often painted as exclusive male preserves, and largely, they were. But reality, like coffee, tends to brew in more complex shades. Women found ways to carve out their own caffeinated sanctuaries. Historians still argue whether women-only coffeehouses truly existed, or if women simply adapted parts of the existing ones during certain hours or in quieter neighborhoods. What's agreed upon is that women, especially in major cities like Istanbul, weren't entirely shut out from coffee culture. Private homes became makeshift cafes. Bathhouses hosted secret coffee gatherings. And some coffeehouses, especially those more tolerant or enterprising, allowed women access during specific times or provided discreet areas just like this. A quirky tidbit for you: in some wealthier circles, women's coffee gatherings turned into full-blown salons. Imagine low tables groaning under the weight of pastries, candied fruits, and delicate porcelain cups, with women trading poetry, gossip, and the occasional scalding political opinion. These were no dainty tea parties. They could be as lively, opinionated, and sharp-tongued as any gathering of men. Here, in this tucked-away corner of the coffeehouse, the atmosphere is easy and familiar. A few women lean in close, discussing something in hushed, urgent tones. Judging by the occasional burst of laughter and dramatic hand gestures, it's no less spirited than the debates at the men's tables. Their clothing is rich in texture, muted in color. Embroidered cuffs flash as hands move, gold-threaded slippers peek out from under embroidered skirts. Each carries a cup, held delicately yet firmly, as if it were a symbol of independence as much as habit. You sense that for these women, the coffeehouse is more than a place to sip a bitter brew. It's a breathing space, a rare slice of autonomy. At home, there are duties, expectations, the endless cycles of household management. Here, for a while, there is talk, laughter, sisterhood. Here, a woman's opinion can unfurl like a freshly woven carpet, admired and argued over in equal measure. You watch as one woman, older, with lines like fine calligraphy at the corners of her mouth, gestures animatedly, her coffee forgotten as she spins a story. The others lean in, riveted. It could be a tale of politics, or poetry, or love lost and won. Whatever it is, it's a performance worthy of any stage. And when the moment calls for it, they too slip into the rituals that bind coffeehouse culture together: a sly pun, a riddle, a playful jab at someone's expense. The laughter that follows is rich, warm, and unrestrained. Despite the partitions, despite the caution, you can tell the coffeehouse spirit, the camaraderie, the quick wit, the unspoken rule that everyone is here for the simple joy of connection. It pulses just as strongly on their side of the room. You sip your coffee, savoring its smoky bitterness, and wonder how many great ideas, revolutions, and rebellions were born not in fiery speeches on the streets, but here, over steaming cups and conspiratorial laughter. And just when you're lost in that thought, something furry brushes against your ankle. You glance down to find a cat, all whiskers and dignity, blinking up at you expectantly. Turns out, the Ottoman coffeehouse had other patrons too, and they didn't need cups or cushions to stake their claim. You freeze, looking down at the small, imperious cat now circling your ankle like it owns the place, which, if you're honest, it probably does. The feline flicks its tail once, precisely, as if evaluating your worthiness. Then, apparently satisfied, it hops lightly onto the cushion beside you, curling into a tight ball with a contented sigh. Welcome to one of the Ottoman coffeehouse's most beloved and unofficial features, pets. Cats, to be exact. Lots of them. It wasn't just tolerance, it was affection. Ottoman coffeehouses, much like the empire's streets and mosques, were famously cat-friendly. The cats lounged under tables, basked in sunbeams near doorways, and, as you're discovering, claimed cushions without the slightest hint of apology. Historians still argue whether this cat culture stemmed from religious sentiments. Islam encourages kindness to animals, particularly cats, or whether it was simply practical. After all, a few well-fed cats kept the mice and rats at bay. Either way, the result was the same. A coffeehouse without a cat, or six, was considered incomplete. And not just cats. Occasionally, coffeehouses played host to dogs, parrots, even nightingales in tiny cages, their lilting songs mingling with the human chatter. But the cats reigned supreme, wandering freely, admired, fed scraps, and stroked absent-mindedly by patrons deep in conversation or thought. Here's a quirky tidbit: in some coffeehouses, regular cats earn nicknames and semi-official titles. You might overhear someone grumble, "Old Vizier's on my cushion again," or "Don't disturb the Admiral, he's keeping score for our chess match." One particularly fat tabby in a famous Istanbul coffeehouse was even jokingly referred to as the Pasha of Puddings, his girth a testament to years of shared delicacies. Your new furry companion lets out a low, grumbly purr, vibrating against your thigh. No one around you so much as raises an eyebrow. If anything, a few patrons smile approvingly. To have a cat choose your company is a silent vote of confidence. You reach down, scratching gently behind the cat's ears. Its purr deepens, rumbling like a miniature drumroll under your hand. You wonder idly how many historical debates were decided not by sharper rhetoric, but by the timely, calming presence of a coffeehouse cat, diffusing tension with a single blink. And the cats, true to their nature, offered impartial judgment. They curled up next to scholars and merchants, poets and carpenters, rebels and loyalists alike. They listened to grand declarations of loyalty and muttered treason with the same sleepy disinterest. They asked for nothing but a warm spot and a crumb or two from your plate. Speaking of which, you realize with mild disappointment, there's no food here for you to sneak to your new friend. Ottoman coffeehouses generally didn't serve meals. No plates of steaming meat or baskets of bread cluttered the tables. Coffee, conversation, and the occasional sweet brought from outside were the main offerings. Still, the cat seems content with the occasional head scratch, its eyes half-lidded in a state of bliss you envy a little. In this world of caffeine and conversation, it turns out the real connoisseurs are the ones who know how to settle in and enjoy the moment without a care. You lean back, mirroring the cat's lazy sprawl, and for the first time tonight, feel the true weight of the coffeehouse's charm settle over you. It's not just the coffee or the chatter or the endless games of backgammon. It's the peace. A living, breathing sort of peace. The kind you share with a curled-up cat, a cooling cup, and the slow, steady murmur of human connection. But just as you start to doze off, the mood shifts again. There's a rustling, a clearing of throats, and someone stands to recite a poem, not just any poem, but part of the nightly ritual of Ottoman coffeehouse poetry battles. And believe me, you haven't truly been entertained until you've seen two grown men duel with couplets. You sit up a little straighter, careful not to disturb the cat now pressed companionably against your hip. Across the room, a man rises. He's slim, wrapped in a modest robe, but the way he clears his throat demands attention. Conversations taper off. Cups are set down. Even the cat seems to perk an ear. The man launches into a poem, his voice slow and deliberate, the cadence hypnotic. Words pour out like coffee from a well-angled sieve, rich and steaming with meaning. No paper, no prompts, this is all from memory. The rhymes catch and tumble, intricate and precise, each couplet a tiny marvel. In the Ottoman coffee house, this wasn't a rare performance. Poetry was as essential as the coffee itself. Recitation contests, munazara, were the order of the day or night, and they weren't stiff, academic affairs either. They were lively, theatrical, often competitive showdowns where wits were tested and egos bruised. Historians still argue whether these poetry battles started in the imperial courts and trickled down or were born right here among the coffee drinkers. Regardless, they flourished in these smoky halls, democratizing an art form once reserved for the wealthy and educated. A quirky tidbit, some coffeehouses had house poets, regulars so skilled in spontaneous verse that they were local celebrities. They could toss off a biting satirical couplet about a politician or weave a love poem so sweet it would make a stone weep, and all without pausing to sip their coffee. Tonight's challenger finishes his piece, to soft applause and a few appreciative hums. No raucous cheering, this is poetry, after all, but enough to signal respect. Then another man stands. He's younger, maybe, with a cocky grin that promises mischief. He bows slightly and, without hesitation, begins his rebuttal, a playful, teasing poem that turns the elder's verses on their head. The crowd chuckles, low and warm, as his words twist and tease, poking gentle fun at the older man's lofty metaphors. The elder, for his part, smiles tightly, sipping his coffee with exaggerated calm, already plotting his next verbal strike. The rules here are unspoken but well understood. Respect the craft, respect the opponent, but don't hold back. Wit wins the day, and a sharp tongue is mightier than any sword. It's a duel where no blood is spilled but many egos are pricked. You glance around and see nods of approval, the occasional whispered commentary. Everyone's a critic here, and no one is shy about it. If a poet stumbles or falls flat, he'll know it by the disappointed clink of a coffee cup or a muttered tisk. But when the words land, oh, when they land, it's magic. Laughter ripples through the room, not loud but deep, shared among friends and rivals alike. You catch a few words, something about the moon blushing at the poet's hubris, and you chuckle along with the others, even if some of the subtler wordplay sails right over your head. Ottoman Turkish poetry is layered, rich with references to history, religion, and classical literature. A single couplet might hide 3 meanings, each more scandalous than the last. The poets trade verses back and forth, the battle escalating, each trying to outwit the other without breaking the rhythm. It's less about winning and more about the dance, the graceful, cunning exchange that leaves the audience grinning. When they finally conclude, with a mutual nod and a flourish, the room sighs and shifts, the tension dissolving like sugar in hot coffee. A few coins are tossed onto a nearby tray, not payment, but tribute, a small thank you for the night's entertainment. The poets settle back into their cushions, drained but smiling, already sipping fresh cups brought by the ever-patient servers. You sit back too, letting the atmosphere settle over you once more. It's only now that you realize how many forms of art live here. Chess and backgammon, jokes and music, and poetry battles so sharp they leave no wounds, only admiration. And as the room starts to buzz again, you hear a whisper of a rumor swirling at a neighboring table, that coffee itself is technically forbidden, banned by decree. Forbidden? You glance down at your cup, still faintly warm, and grin. Nothing forbidden ever tasted this good. You raise an eyebrow, peering over your cup. Forbidden? Surely that's a joke, a bit of late-night mischief to spice up the conversation. But the faces around the table are serious, leaning in as if trading state secrets. In the Ottoman Empire, coffee wasn't just a drink, it was a problem. At least, according to the authorities. Historians still argue whether coffee's early bans were truly about religious concerns or if they were thinly veiled political moves to curb public dissent. Either way, it's true, coffee was declared illegal more than once, starting in the 16th century under Sultan Murad III, and later more aggressively by Sultan Murad IV, who took personal offense to anything that smelled like sedition, including coffee. The official reason? Some scholars argued coffee was an intoxicant, and thus forbidden under Islamic law, lumping it in with alcohol. The truth was likely more complicated. Coffeehouses had become hubs of chatter, satire, gossip, and, worse, political plotting. Too many cups, too much thinking. Dangerous business for an empire built on stability. A quirky tidbit, Murad IV, infamous for his fierce enforcement of moral laws, allegedly patrolled Istanbul's streets in disguise at night, personally hunting down drinkers, smokers, and yes, coffeehouse patrons. Getting caught with a cup of coffee could earn you a brutal beating or worse, though the severity of punishment often depended on the sultan's mood or the thickness of your wallet. You glance around this cozy coffeehouse and try to imagine it shuttered, silent. The tables empty, the cushions abandoned, the laughter and music gone. It's hard to picture. This place feels too alive, too necessary, like cutting off the city's circulation. And yet, despite the bans, coffeehouses endured. They simply went underground, quite literally, in some cases. Basement cafes sprung up. Private homes doubled as secret coffee salons. Coffee was smuggled, brewed behind closed doors, passed hand to hand like some illicit treasure. Here's the delicious irony. The more rulers tried to stamp out coffee culture, the more firmly it took root. Banning coffee only made it more desirable, more subversive. Nothing says rebellion quite like sipping a forbidden cup in plain sight. You glance into your cup, the dark dregs swirling at the bottom like a miniature storm, and smile. It's still warm, still rich, still dangerous in that quiet, everyday way that real revolutions are. And sitting here, tucked into a corner of the empire's rebellious heart, you realize that coffeehouses weren't just places to relax, they were places to resist, to challenge, to imagine something different. The bans would eventually ease, of course. Common sense, or perhaps common craving, prevailed. Coffeehouses roared back to life, more popular than ever. The sultans might have won a few battles, but they lost the war against coffee. You look around and feel the unspoken defiance humming through the room. The poets with their sharp verses. The backgammon players with their noisy victories. The cats curled up like little, furry revolutionaries. And every single cup of coffee, lifted in quiet rebellion against the notion that thought could, or should, be controlled. And as you listen to the soft murmur of news spreading from table to table, you realize that in many ways, these coffeehouses were more than just havens. They were the empire's newspapers long before the first printing press landed on Ottoman soil. You lean in, listening as snippets of news flutter from table to table like restless birds. Hear a whispered rumor about a military campaign faltering at the edges of the empire. There a juicy piece of gossip about a vizier's son marrying far beneath his station. No parchment, no presses, no official censors in sight, just voices, coffee, and the slow but relentless spread of information. In a world before newspapers, coffeehouses were the newsstands. They pulsed with fresh tidings, faster and more colorfully than any royal decree nailed to a gate. If something happened in the palace, on the battlefield, or even in the spice markets, you could bet it would reach your coffee cup before it reached the official record. Historians still argue whether this informal news network helped or hindered the Ottoman Empire's cohesion. Was it a lifeline for a sprawling, diverse population hungry for information? Or a breeding ground for dangerous rumors and civil unrest? Probably both. A quirky tidbit, in some parts of the empire, coffeehouses became so notorious for rumor-mongering that local officials stationed listeners among the patrons, essentially human news filters tasked with catching dangerous chatter before it boiled over into rebellion. Imagine trying to enjoy your cup of bitter brew while wondering if the quiet fellow two cushions over was secretly reporting your every sarcastic comment to the authorities. But despite the risks, people kept talking, kept whispering, kept knowing things. An entire oral network stretched across cities and provinces, carried by traders, scholars, soldiers, and sailors, all meeting in coffeehouses to swap not just goods and services but stories. You listen now as a merchant from the docks spins a tale about a fleet of Portuguese ships sighted far too close to Ottoman waters. His audience leans in, cups forgotten, eyes bright with a hunger that only fresh, forbidden news can satisfy. Facts mix with embellishments. Eyewitness accounts blur with hearsay. Truths stretch thinner than the well-worn rugs underfoot, but somehow, in the weaving, a picture emerges. And it wasn't just politics or war. Coffeehouse news included poetry trends, religious debates, shifts in fashion, prices of silk and spices, births and deaths of people who mattered, and people who didn't. The first whiff of plague? You'd hear about it here. A change in the Grand Vizier's fortune? It would hit your coffeehouse long before it hit your tax bill. You glance down at your empty cup, thinking how small and ordinary it seems. And yet it's this humble vessel that fuels the exchange. Coffee sharpened minds, lengthened conversations, coaxed out opinions and confessions that otherwise might have stayed hidden. It's why the rulers feared the coffeehouses. They were unpredictable, sprawling things. You couldn't stamp them out without stamping out half the social life of the empire. And so, more often than not, they were left to simmer, watched closely, occasionally rated, but never truly silenced. As you sit back, the cat purring against your leg, you realize that every cup pour here is more than just a drink. It's a catalyst. A quiet rebellion brewed strong and black, thick as the grounds at the bottom of your cup. And if you think all that caffeine only fueled idle gossip, think again. Sometimes it spurred more ambitious plots, ones that stretched from these low tables straight to the imperial court itself. You take a breath, feeling the buzz of caffeine and conversation wrap around you like a familiar cloak. It's easy to forget, with all the laughter and lazy games of backgammon, that beneath this relaxed surface, something more electric hums. Ideas aren't just exchanged here, they're sharpened. In the Ottoman Empire, rulers learned to fear the coffeehouse not just as a den of rumors, but as a cradle of conspiracy. Over tiny cups and soft cushions, entire rebellions were whispered into existence. Courtiers plotted palace intrigue. Guilds organized protests. Students debated philosophies so radical it could scorch the sultan's turban right off his head. Historians still argue whether the Janissaries, the empire's elite and notoriously rowdy military corps, used coffeehouses as unofficial meeting halls. But what's clear is that coffeehouses became hubs of not just social, but political life. You could sip coffee in the morning and be caught in the gears of a coup by nightfall. A quirky tidbit, Ottoman rulers, sensing the danger, occasionally sent spies into the coffeehouses. These agents, armed with keen ears and thick beards for anonymity, would sit silently, pretending to play chess or smoke a narghileh pipe, while memorizing names and whispers. They weren't always successful. Coffeehouse regulars developed a sixth sense for spotting imposters. If a man seemed too quiet, too interested in listening but never speaking, he might find himself subtly frozen out, or simply served a particularly unpleasant cup. You glance around the room now with new eyes. The laughter, the joking, the casual debates about poetry and politics, it's all part of the camouflage. In a world where open dissent could earn you a flogging or worse, the coffeehouse was both shield and sword. Here, under the smoke and chatter, discontent brewed alongside the coffee. It wasn't always grand revolutions either. Sometimes it was smaller, subtler acts of rebellion, a new poem passed hand to hand that mocked a corrupt governor. A clever play staged in a backroom, satirizing the tax collectors. A boycott organized against an unpopular market regulation. It all started here, with a few voices, a few sips, a few dangerous ideas swirling like smoke above the tables. And it wasn't just men of power who came here to stir the pot. Students, apprentices, artisans, they all found their way to the coffeehouses. Places where they could dream out loud, argue over verses and verses of philosophy, and quietly wonder why the world was the way it was, and how it could be otherwise. The sultans could command armies. They could issue decrees. They could build mosques and palaces that reached toward heaven itself. But they could never fully control what happened in the coffeehouses. Not really. Not entirely. You sip the last cooled remnants of your coffee, feeling the grit of grounds against your tongue. Around you, the room thrums with the quiet energy of 100 half-formed ideas. Someone might be writing a poem in their head that will be recited for centuries. Someone else might be plotting a protest that topples a governor. And someone, maybe even you, is simply sitting back, feeling history simmer all around. And yet, as timeless as it feels now, this golden era of relaxed rules and open cups would not last forever. A chill would eventually creep into the cozy warmth of the coffeehouses, changing them in ways that even the most astute poets couldn't predict. You shift slightly, sensing a subtle shift in the air, as if the room itself knows what's coming. For decades, the coffeehouses had thrived, weaving themselves into the empire's very fabric. But no golden age lingers untouched. Change, slow and patient as a coffee drip, was already seeping in. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Ottoman coffeehouse was evolving. New rulers, suspicious of these smoky dens of opinion, began to impose stricter regulations. Coffeehouses faced curfews. Licenses were required. Certain sensitive topics, read, anything remotely critical of the government, became risky to discuss openly. Historians still argue whether this tightening of control was due to real political threats or simply the Sultan's growing fear of a more educated, restless populace. Either way, the easygoing, anything-goes vibe of the classic Ottoman coffeehouse began to fade. A quirky tidbit, officials even banned certain games like chess and backgammon in coffeehouses for a time, claiming they encouraged idleness and distracted from religious duties. Imagine walking into your favorite haunt, only to find the boards confiscated, the dice silenced, the playful tension gone. It was like clipping the wings of a bird mid-flight. You can almost hear the difference. The lively debates that once filled the room were dulled to a cautious hum. People spoke in lowered tones, glancing over their shoulders. Poets who once tossed verses like pebbles into a pond now tucked their words deep into their pockets. Even the cats seemed to sense the new atmosphere, slinking closer to the shadows. And it wasn't just censorship. The coffeehouses themselves began to change shape. European influences crept in, tables and chairs replaced low cushions, elaborate chandeliers replaced humble lanterns. Coffee preparation shifted too, with new machines hissing and steaming, churning out cup after cup faster than the slow, ceremonial says ever could. These changes weren't all bad, of course. The empire was modernizing, adjusting to new realities. But something was lost, the slow, communal spirit of the old coffeehouses, where time melted away and a single cup could last an entire evening of storytelling, laughter, and low-stakes revolution. You glance around the room now, trying to imagine it with stiff-backed chairs instead of cushions, customers rushing in and out, coffee sloshed into paper cups instead of carefully poured into delicate porcelain. It's a different world, one you know all too well. Fast, convenient, disposable. You can't help but feel a pang of loss for a time when coffee was an experience, not just fuel. When a cafe was a second home, not a pit stop. When conversation wasn't shouted over blaring music, but whispered, argued, and sung until the stars faded and the city yawned awake. As the empire creaked into its final centuries, many of the old coffeehouses either vanished or transformed beyond recognition. New laws, new fashions, new ways of being. But those few that clung to the old ways, tucked into forgotten alleys and behind modest doors, became havens for the stubborn, the nostalgic, the ones who still believed that a good cup of coffee deserved an afternoon's worth of attention. You sit back, the empty cup warming your palm, and wonder if the patrons of those earlier centuries felt it too, that quiet, bittersweet end of an era. But endings, like the last sip of a strong brew, can linger longer than you expect. And sometimes, they leave behind a flavor that never truly disappears. After all, the Ottoman coffeehouse may have changed, but its spirit? That still lingers, stubborn as ever, in places you might not expect. You cradle the empty cup, turning it slowly between your hands, feeling the faint ridges of its glaze. Around you, the coffeehouse hums with a gentle kind of energy, familiar, unhurried. A man leans in to whisper a joke. A woman tucks a stray lock of hair behind her ear, laughing quietly. A backgammon board clatters in the corner. Life, simple and stubborn. Even as the Ottoman Empire stumbled toward its slow, inevitable decline, the spirit of the coffeehouse refused to vanish. It adapted, it waited, and, remarkably, it found ways to echo down through centuries. Today, whether you sit in a cafe in Istanbul, a snug spot in Sarajevo, or a bustling teahouse in Cairo, you can still feel the fingerprints of those old Ottoman gatherings. The low tables might have risen, the cushions might have given way to chairs, but the heart of it, the conversation, the slow sip of coffee, the stubborn resistance to hurry, survives. Historians still argue whether the modern coffeehouse culture owes more to the Ottomans or to European cafes that developed later. But sit long enough in a quiet cafe anywhere in the old empire's shadow, and you'll see it, friends lingering long after their cups are empty, lone dreamers scribbling into notebooks, laughter that ripples without hurry, the slow, sacred art of doing absolutely nothing but being. A quirky tidbit to end with, some traditional Turkish coffeehouses today still serve their brews in those tiny, handleless cups, the coffee thick, the grounds settling patiently at the bottom, just as they did centuries ago. Some things, it seems, don't need reinventing. You smile to yourself, thinking how many modern coffee rituals, lingering over a latte, arguing politics over an espresso, nursing a cappuccino while scribbling ideas, owe a quiet debt to these old Ottoman halls where coffee wasn't just a drink. It was a lifestyle. A slow revolution. The cat beside you stretches and yawns, curling tighter against your leg. The lamps flicker low. Someone plucks at a lute in the background, the notes soft and forgiving. You close your eyes for a moment, just breathing it all in. And maybe, just maybe, you realize you're not so different from those long-ago patrons. A little more distracted by screens, maybe. A little faster on your feet. But deep down, still chasing the same thing, a place to pause, to think, to dream over a warm cup. You rise slowly, careful not to jostle the sleeping cat, and leave your cup on the low table. No rush. No pressure. You'll settle up later, or maybe the universe will settle it for you, in its own time. As you step into the cool night air, the smell of coffee and old wood still clinging to your clothes, you carry a little piece of the Ottoman coffeehouse with you, a memory brewed dark, rich, and impossibly enduring. The night presses gently against your skin, cool and quiet, as you walk slowly away from the glowing doorway. Behind you, the coffeehouse breathes on, the murmur of voices fading into the distance, the last chords of a lute trailing like mist in the air. You feel lighter somehow, as if time itself has stretched and softened around you. Your steps are slower, your breath deeper, each exhale carrying away the weight of the day. In your mind's eye, the images linger, a cracked porcelain cup, a game half-finished, the flick of a cat's tail, the warm, golden glow of lantern light against ancient stone walls. The world outside hums with its usual rush, but you're not in a hurry anymore. You carry with you the lesson of the Ottoman coffeehouse, not just the history, not just the coffee, but the gentle rebellion of stillness. The reminder that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is to sit, to sip, and to listen. To let time unfurl slowly, richly, without demand. You smile into the night, letting your thoughts drift like smoke into the star-patched sky. Somewhere, another door creaks open. Another cup is poured. Another conversation begins. And you, dear listener, you're part of that tradition now too, an honorary patron of that old, timeless cafe where the rules are simple. Stay as long as you like, speak your mind, and savor every sip. Sleep well, with the taste of history still warm on your tongue. Sweet dreams.